Hello everyone, Thersites the Historian here. In passing, I have mentioned that my actual specialty is ancient Greece, but yet I don't really make that many videos on the topic. Why, you might ask, is that? Well, one, when you're writing a dissertation on something, there's only so much you can take of that topic before you feel like you're going to completely lose your mind. But the other thing is that when it comes to ancient Greek history, it's surprisingly difficult to describe, especially in a popular setting, or it's also difficult to simplify in many ways. And the reason for that is because, unlike, say, Rome, Greece was never politically unified. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Corcyra, Argos, all of these places have their own histories, their own customs. There are significant differences between these places, and it's really hard to paint them with a single brush. Not to mention that there are Ionian Greeks in Asia Minor, you have Greeks in Sicily, and there are plenty of differences between all of them. And that extends even to the form of warfare that they use, since they have different ways of preparing for that warfare. So what I would like to do is go through this article and just explain how many of the things that are said here are based on mostly assumptions that can't really be proven, or that they're based on only one interpretation where scholars really aren't sure and have multiple interpretations in the air right now. So, this hopefully will both be a critique of this article and also explain to you why I don't do more of these videos, because as you'll see, the amount that we actually know with dead certainty about ancient Greece is surprisingly little given how much study has been given to ancient Greece in Western society over the last few centuries. So let's get started and look at the introduction. So the introduction is on your screen. You can read it at your leisure, but basically this is fine. You know, the hopla is just the equipment that the hoplite uses. That's where the name comes from. The name actually didn't come about until fairly late in the hoplite's life. Late 5th, early 4th century is the first actual use of the term hoplite. But anyway, all of this is pretty much fine, except for the idea, well, the idea that's not stated. So here they say that the Greek hoplite was a citizen soldier, and that's largely true. But one important thing needs to be noted: there were lots and lots of mercenary hoplites. We've always known about them being very abundant during the 4th century and also during the Peloponnesian War period. However, there is some recent scholarship that suggests they were also pretty abundant during the Archaic period, and that in fact the first people that we see who wore the hopla may have been mercenaries fighting in the Assyrian army way back in about the 7th century. So, I think that's a nice little note, but because that's a very recent and I don't think fully supported piece of scholarship, that wouldn't obviously make it into this list. And I mean, most of these lists are made based off of Wikipedia entries, and it looks like also this author heavily consulted a work on the subject by Nicholas Secunda, who is one of the major hoplite scholars. Another interesting side note while we're talking about Nicholas Secunda is that normally the guy that people always turn to as their one source, or they take as being like the basic information on hoplites, would always be Victor Davis Hanson. So I found it interesting that they went with Nicholas Secunda. And that's not a complaint, by the way, because I think that Hanson is massively overrated, and also his scholarship is being challenged pretty heavily right now. So that's all fine and well by me. Although, based on what Secunda supposedly says, or at least how this person interprets Secunda here, I'm not as thrilled with him either. So anyway, we'll get to that when we get to that. So first of all, the first point that is made here, the thing you might not have known, is that there are tribes without blood relations. Okay, there's a big problem with this though. First of all, this person says that these tribes only emerged in the 7th century. We actually don't know when they emerged. When it comes to almost anything in the Archaic period, there are scholars who argue for an 8th century date, a pre-8th century date, 7th century, 6th century, and even like right before the Classical period date. Also, in most cities, there were usually 3 or 4 tribes, but Athens artificially reorganized all of their tribes under Cleisthenes. What we call the democratic reforms of 509 and 508 BCE the Athenians referred to as the tribal reforms, and those reforms were definitely for military purposes. So the thing is, with other cities, we don't know when and why or even how they reformed their tribes. We also don't know that they were seen as artificial or understood to be artificial. Because the tribes across many different cities usually had the same names, this implies, and this also helped to confirm that notion of the Doric migration, at least among many Greeks. The fact that all these tribes have the same names across different cities. The Athenians just blew that up and came up with their own naming scheme, 10 tribes after 10 local heroes from their mythology. So anyway, I think in this case, maybe this person read up a little bit on Athens and then tried to apply that to the other Greek states, and doesn't quite fit. Also, it's worth noting that the amount of evidence we have about Athens massively outstrips the amount of information we have about anywhere else. So, the degree to which Athens was typical can be debated. It was probably more typical than Sparta, but it's really hard to know because we don't have that much evidence to go on. Okay, the Oath of the Youths. This was probably the most off of any of the points that were made here. And the reason here is not because it wasn't a thing, it was, but because it is out of chronological order. So, the ephebate was an institute for training for young men when they came of age in Athens, but it probably didn't exist until after the Battle of Chaeronea in 338, and it would have been disbanded when Athenian democracy was ended in 322. So this was not something that even got to impact an entire generation. But obviously the idea here was to prepare a new generation of Athenians to go to war. And it also trained them in civic duties and gave them their polis's history and did all that kind of stuff. So this was an important institution, but it only lasted for a small amount of time. Theoretically, if it had existed earlier, it might have done a lot of good, but it was one of those cases of too little too late. And the oath here is often cited. Actually, I toured the Ohio State House a couple days ago, and they have quotes from this oath. It's worth reading. It's interesting. But a lot of people don't really put it in its proper chronological context and see that it was kind of a last-ditch effort. Alright. So, the hoplite race, the Hoplitodromos. So here there are also some fairly serious errors, and they're all based directly on the Wikipedia page. I checked, and that's where all the information for this must have come from. I believe there was also a book cited on that Wikipedia page, one of which was the Secunda book, and another one was a book on ancient athletics. At any rate, though, this does not date to 520. The first known instance of this tactic being used that we know about was actually at Marathon in 490. It's possible that Miltiades, who thought this up, he was an experienced general who had served basically as a local warlord before going back to Athens. It's possible he had learned about this previously, or it might have been used by the Ionians during their revolt against the Persians in the earlier 490s. At any rate, though, the first time we know of this being done was at Marathon in 490. And the reason why they did it is because they were trying to close the distance with the Persian archers. So they were fighting against an open plain. The Persians had far more archers than they did, and they didn't want to just get picked off as they were advancing slowly across the field, so they closed the distance as quickly as possible. The other thing, too, to keep in mind that I guess isn't really talked about here is that when we're talking about athletics in the Greek world, this is not something that would have been done by all the hoplites. So hoplites stretch from basically the middle class to the elite. And pretty much all the athletes, all the people who would have had the kind of leisure time to pursue athletics would have all been elite youths. So anyone who would compete in the Hoplitodromos at a fair would just be a single competitor from the richest segment of society looking for distinction. So it wouldn't be something that would be actually useful for hoplites as a whole, since it would involve so few of them taking up this training. And it would just be sort of a novelty. The real trick would be if you could get your guys to move in formation at a high speed, and most scholars are pretty critical of the ability of Greek hoplites to get that done because it would be a very difficult undertaking. So anyway, that is what I have to say about that. Let's move on to section 4, buddies and lovers. And once again, we see that there's some fairly big misconceptions that have been put out in the past and then just repeated over and over. So the thing is, once again, just like with the Hoplitodromos, the institution of pederasty, where an older man takes a younger man as his lover slash mentee. This is something that is very much confined to the elite, and there's actually no reason to think that homosexuality was a regular or required feature of this relationship. In fact, it looks like it was probably only the case when both parties were in fact gay. So when we look at the ancient world, we have to realize that the concept of homosexuality, i.e., only having sexual feelings for members of the same gender, was not a concept. There were people who had desires that involved having sex with people of the same gender, but they didn't necessarily have an identity grouping that went along with that. Also, the degree of prejudice that we might think as of being present actually wasn't. So while it wasn't a completely open and accepting society, it also wasn't completely closed to the idea of men dallying around or women doing whatever. The real kicker here was that if a man were to be involved in a homosexual relationship, the thing that mattered was whether he penetrated or was penetrated. Basically, was he the pitcher or the catcher? If you're the pitcher and you get caught, you're fine. Men are supposed to pitch, if you will. However, if you're the catcher, well, then you played the role of a woman and you disgraced yourself. So, if two guys were to get caught doing this, then in theory, the guy who got caught on the receiving end would be banned from public speaking because he would have dishonored himself and proven himself to be not a real man. The other guy, though, nothing. Nothing happens, so far as we know. And this is also a matter of great debate, as you might imagine. Our evidence is limited. One of our major sources here is actually Xenophon. He lists Xenophon. Xenophon actually had a stronger opinion than most on this. He was actually against allowing lovers to serve side by side in hoplite phalanxes because he said it was bad for discipline. And his example was the Theban sacred band, where all of them were supposedly lovers. But that's probably an exaggeration. It would be hard to make it to where all your 300 best hoplites are all gay guys, considering that, gay people aren't a huge percentage of the population. Not only that, but a lot of it was Xenophon's personal prejudice coming into play, and he also never really shows any examples of it being the case that the lack of discipline from having that kind of close relationship would be outweighed by the passion that people would fight with. So he never really makes the case, and it's just a matter of him opining. Other people had different opinions. Yeah, there are plenty of times where people were accused of things like this, but it couldn't be proven. So it's one of those things where a lot of the attention that we've had for this over the years, a lot of the scholarly attention, stems from the fact that the classics field, I think either in England or just America, or maybe both for a long time, was dominated by disproportionately gay scholars. So they were really interested in this question, and unfortunately they sort of indulged in a bit of wishful thinking when it came to inflating the number of gay Greeks. But really, I seriously can't imagine that it would be any more than you would have in any other population. It just wouldn't make sense. And again, this kind of behavior was only really acceptable to the elite because they were the elite. They could more or less do what they want so long as they produce children to pass on their estates to, and then perform their military and financial duties to the state. So let's move on to the fifth thing involved with hoplite warfare that you might not have known about. The best belong to the front and rear rank of a hoplite phalanx. Of all the things in this article, this might be the best. It's basically correct. But the other thing that you have to realize is the real points where it's vital to have an experienced and skilled man are actually on the ends of the lines in order to keep order when you're turning and changing formations. You need people at the ends of the lines who can direct others and keep them straight and in step. Xenophon used an analogy for training here that this person makes out like they were really, always totally in line and completely harmonious. But if they always were like that, then Xenophon wouldn't have to constantly urge young men to spend more time on their training and invest a lot of money in their horses and stuff like that. Because all of his works are full of all this advice for young guys to train harder and really dedicate their youth to training for war. Also, the idea of the rear ranks pushing in a hoplite battle. This is something that is part of the literal school of hoplite warfare led by Victor Davis Hanson, and it is not universally accepted. Some scholars reject it altogether, and others say that the effectiveness of a push is massively exaggerated because the more people you have, the less force they can add to the push as you go along. So you'd have to stack a phalanx super deep to get any appreciable advantage over the normal 8 deep. And we have some evidence of that. So it does look like there were pushes, but for the most part it looks like the push model that Davis Hanson pushes so hard actually is pretty overrated, and that most battles did not come down to a push or did not start with a charge like he says they did. But they don't really go into that in this article too much, so I guess we can, move past it. Let's see, what is the next item? Armor. Okay. And once again, this is basically correct, but it also sort of misses the point. So yes, for the most part, what we see with the hoplite panoply is that it gets lighter in weight over time. That's true. But, and also the shields weren't really that much heavier than like a Roman shield or something like that, so it's not like these things were arm breakers. I remember reading one old article or book one time where they estimated the weight of a hoplite shield at about 40 pounds, and that's just a massive exaggeration. The estimate here about 13.5 is probably way more accurate. But anyway, the thing is, it is still larger, heavier, and more protective than most of the things that it would meet in battle. So remember, heavy is a relative term. So if you're fighting a Persian and they have a wicker shield, then your shield that's made out of wood with some bronze in key places is way heavier. Your corselet, which will either be a thick linen or maybe have a little bit of bronze involved, is way thicker. If you have greaves on your shins, those are something your opponent won't have. The upshot is, also your helmet will be a lot stronger. The upshot is you can possibly take a hit and not take damage, or at least not take debilitating damage, whereas if they take your spear, they're going down. Another thing to note that rarely gets pointed out, partly because Victor Davis Hanson dominates this field so much and he always focuses on the armor, is that the Greeks also have what we could think of as firepower, in the sense that their spear is an excellent thrusting weapon because it's well balanced, and the butt spike adds more weight and force to the front end. The Greek short sword is pretty similar to the Roman short sword and is good for both stabbing and cutting. So if the Greeks had to go into close quarters, they would have that. It was high quality, it could be used for a long period of time. And because of the combination of being able to possibly take a hit, being able to fight in a formation, and then having weapons that were very effective killing tools, this is what made the Greek hoplites effective heavy infantry, not because they were objectively as heavy as something like a medieval knight. Alright, so let's go to item number 7. And here's a case where if I weren't writing about this topic right now, I would probably just say this is correct and move on. There actually is a little bit of debate about what these crests were used for. Now, I think most scholars do agree that these things were just for show and pomp, maybe an intimidation factor, maybe to distinguish some men for the benefit of their own side, whatever. But it looks like the most recent hoplite monograph by Bardunius and Ray actually suggests that in the early stages of a hoplite battle, people used the tiring overhand thrust. And holding the spear up that high and then thrusting down wears out your arm really fast. People stop doing it after a while. after a few minutes, actually, if that. Anyway, the idea that they had is that these pumps add a little bit more metal to your helmet, and that it might be useful in deflecting an overhand thrust at your helmet or two. So it actually might serve a practical purpose, even if it also is for show and pomp. So just something to think about. And again, when it comes to these theoretical reconstructions of equipment and all that, it's a lot of it is just based on opinion, and it's hard to know for certain. The Greeks never really left us with detailed accounts of, you know, what each piece did and how exactly you fight a hoplite battle, how you held the spear, all that stuff that scholars sometimes debate, didn't quite make it into the ancient literature. Let's look at item number 8. Physical infirmity was possibly mostly overlooked in case of Spartan hoplites. And here they use the example of Agesilaus's lameness. The thing is, you got to realize here, with the Spartans, they have a limited population. They can't really afford to get rid of the infants that grew up with slight disabilities. Agesilaus was of the royal family. And we're talking about him being lame. We're talking about he had a slight limp. This is a guy who was clearly physically viable. He had a lot of energy. He served in the field well into his 80s. So the idea that he was disabled or really significantly hobbled is kind of ridiculous. And if we look at how a hoplite battle's probably fought, most of it involves a lot of standing. So if you're standing and exchanging spear thrust, you don't necessarily have to have a lot of ability for that as long as you got the skill down. Or if we go with the pushing model, whether it's true or not, or how often it's done, because I think everybody kind of agrees it happens once in a while. So the thing is, like, if you're in the rear ranks of a push, all you have to do is, you know, brace yourself, put your shield on the guy in front of you's back, take a shield on your back, and push. You don't have to be an Olympic class athlete to contribute to that. You don't have to be able to compete with Jesse Owens in a sprint for that. So the degree of disability that they're talking about here is something that should not be over exaggerated. And the other thing too is that a lot of guys, even if they were born without a limp or anything, over the years they were going to take injuries, as you might imagine, and this is true for Spartans as well. In Sparta, you were eligible for military service up to the age of 60. So it would be very difficult to spend your entire life training for war and athletics and not sustain injuries. So by the time that they were done with their military careers, a lot of Spartans would be hobbled. They would have aches, pains, bad joints, all kinds of things, and there's no way that they were all in completely clear health by the time they got out of it, right? I mean, it's not a realistic expectation. And I think part of this is part of what is called the Spartan mirage, where we as moderns really look at Sparta in an idealized sense that maybe overlooks a lot of practical limitations that they actually suffered from. So anyway, let's go to item number 9, wine before battle. You know, I think you can make a case for wine before and after battle, but you know, for the Greeks, I guess it was more useful before because you got to steel your nerves. Common thing to do, you know, in musket battles, people used to like to take whiskey beforehand. Anyway, so the only thing I'd note here is that while this is basically accurate, that people want to take wine before battle to still their nerves, another thing we have to realize about warfare is that it is not necessarily always planned out neatly, and that things don't always go the way that you want them to go. So ideally, yeah, you have food and drink before you fight a battle. But again, war is dynamic and unpredictable. So let's say you're taken by surprise. If an enemy's marching on you at that moment, you don't call pause, set up your camp, drink a glass of wine, and then fight them on your own terms. You turn around, drop your bags, or drop your baggage, I guess your servants do it, and then you go fight right then and there because people are coming at you. And the other thing is, too, along this line, another thing I'd like to point out is that these hoplite battles never actually followed a set-piece, ritualistic manner. Like, so a lot of people have this idea of the archaic period as when hoplite battles were fought in a formulaic, ritualistic manner with all kinds of rules and regulations involved. And that's just not the case. Generals would always look to get the leg up. That's just the way these battles were fought. there's no such thing as a pure regular battle. All of these things are contingent upon things like surprise, morale, having better supplies, having the sun in your face or not, having wind and dust in your face or not. Look, it's just there's no such thing as a pure battle. Another thing too is that in this article they make it out like people were really getting sauced pretty good before they went out there to fight. But another thing you got to remember is they're fighting in the Greek summer for the most part. Usually summer, maybe very early fall, very late spring. So it's always going to be warm. And I don't know if you've ever been outside and tried to drink before in the summer, but you're more limited than you are in other seasons. Not to mention they're strapping on bronze armor, which is very hot. So, the amount of drinking they're going to be able to do is not as great as maybe is implied in this article. And last but not least, one thing that's basically true, again, is that morale is more important than strength and numbers. I should say strength and numbers rather than in. Okay. So, I basically agree, but I will make the reservation here that morale is something that stems from confidence and training, preparation, morale, good leadership, all of things which could be calculated as more material factors. So I think that when we say that morale is more important than these other things, we ignore the relationship between morale and those things. So in many ways, saying that morale is more important objectively than numbers or training or whatever creates a false dichotomy. So really, morale is a product of those things, and I think that once you get a high level of morale, that's really something that will carry you through against equal forces. So if you have two forces that are equally well prepared, but one of them has fought before and they believe in their general, that force is probably going to win because of their morale. But the thing is, again, you have to get to that morale, and it can't come from nothing. It has to have a source somewhere. So that would be my only objection, and in that case, maybe I'm being a little too picky. But at any rate, though, I just wanted to talk about hoplites a little bit before I get back into writing about them, which is a much more onerous task. And I also just wanted to give you all sort of an indication of why presenting Greek history can be a pain in the ass at times, since there are so many things that we don't know or that are hotly debated, and where we just don't have as much evidence as we'd like to sort those things out to our fullest satisfaction. Anyway, I'm Thucydides the Historian, and I will see you around the tube of you.